Tātou nau mai, haere mai I tēnei kaupapa whakahirahira. Haere mai ki te whānau kia New Zealand. Haere mai ki te whānau Kerridge Partners. Toni, tēnā koe e hoa, e rangatira nā wahine toa kai whakahere o kia New Zealand. Nō reira, kia pai tō rā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's a very warm welcome to you all. Make special mention of Toni, Chief Executive and wonderful leader of Kia New Zealand, welcoming the families of both Kia and also Kerridge to this event, and also the leaders who have gathered here today. So wonderful to have you all today together, celebrating I guess the opportunity to learn from each other. So I encourage you to embrace this event with curiosity and generosity, and offer you a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Peter, for such a warm welcome, and just to extend Kia's welcome as well to everyone here this morning. It's wonderful to be able to get together face to face in person, a privilege that many around the world don't have. It's lovely to see so many bright faces this morning, and to be talking about a topic that is so close to the hearts of Kia, that is returning Kiwis. The team and I were sat around sort of August, September last year thinking, gosh, there are a lot of our Kiwi community coming home. How can we support them? And what might they be able to bring to New Zealand in return? So we pulled together what we thought was going to be quite a small survey. We shared it with a number of our partners around the globe, with our High Commission partners and the team at MFAT, and it spread far and wide, and we ended up with 15,000 Kiwis across 185 countries filling out the survey. What that told us was that they had stories that they wanted to tell. They had feedback that they wanted to give us here in New Zealand. So it was wonderful to be able to curate some of that data and share it with a number of groups within New Zealand who are looking to support these Kiwis. And I've got, just to kick us off this morning, I've got a few data points to share with you, just to really set the scene about why now, why this moment in time is so important and such a great opportunity for New Zealand. I will say that the data points that I'll talk to you this morning were gathered in August, September last year. We are about to go out and do another survey. We're going to hopefully be launching at the end of this month. And we will be looking to do a refresh to understand, what some of the geopolitical changes around the world, what the vaccine programs, and just sort of the moving feast that is COVID-19 and the impact that has had on our returning Kiwis. So please do keep an eye out for that survey that will be coming out, and we would love to get everyone back together in a few months' time to share some refreshed data. But certainly what we learnt in August, September last year was that there was a high percentage of our Kiwis who were wanting to come home. So of the 15,000 that filled out the survey, 49% said that they would like to come home within the next 4 years. And so when you look at pure New Zealand citizen net migration into the country, that does represent a reasonable increase on Kiwis wanting to come home. When we spoke to them about what their reasons were for returning, a good 50% of them said that COVID had either had a direct impact, it was the catalyst for them wanting to move, or it would significantly speed up their decisions to come home. So it really was, quite a crucial moment in time for New Zealand citizen migration home. What we also learned was that those who were wanting to come home were wanting to make the move permanently. So they weren't coming back to New Zealand to duck for cover. 75% of them wanted to come back to build a new life for them, for their families. I think from COVID, they had realised that they couldn't just nip home to see older family members, to see friends and colleagues. So they wanted to be here in New Zealand with familiar places, spaces and faces. And you really, at a time like this, you really can't replace that feeling of home. And so I think that's really what a lot of our Kiwis around the world were feeling. For New Zealand, as a country with these Kiwis coming home, what we also learnt was that it represented an enormous opportunity. So Kiwis were coming home to build communities. So they had quite large philanthropic aspirations. About 63% wanted to give their time to charities. Another 24% wanted to make monetary donations. So what a wonderful opportunity for New Zealand and some of the causes that are closest to our hearts. In addition to that, these Kiwis had been away for 8 to 10 years on average, so a long time. They were Kiwis that had built really successful careers and often businesses overseas. And a number of these Kiwis were looking to either bring businesses home with them or start a new business once they were here. Of the Kiwis who had already returned to New Zealand when we ran this survey, about 8% were looking to start a business that would employ between 2 and 5 people. So that was, a wonderful opportunity. In addition, around 20% of Kiwis were looking to move back to regions in New Zealand that weren't main centres, but equally weren't parts of the country that they grew up in. So they were coming home and thinking about places within New Zealand, such as the Coromandel, Northland, other slightly more remote spots that they could build home and community and business. So it also represented a wonderful opportunity for regional development within New Zealand and the support of our communities. I think possibly one of the stats that landed best with us, with me and with Kia, was the fact that a number of these senior Kiwis who were coming home with skills in areas where New Zealand was really lacking them. So if you look at our skill shortages within New Zealand, they are big in areas of senior technology leaders, of healthcare. I think many countries around the world would be envious of more healthcare workers coming back into the country. But these were the exact categories that Kiwis were looking to come home with skills and experience in. So from a talent perspective, these returning Kiwis had the opportunity to plug in really nicely with some of the skills gaps within New Zealand. So I think, look, the overarching message here for us was that there was a significant number of Kiwis coming back, and certainly as you track those who have come through managed isolation over the last year or so, the figures that we predicted are more or less on track. They were coming home with community aspirations. They weren't just coming home to duck for cover. They were bringing home families and pets. They were looking to build a life here, and they were coming home with skills that could be really fantastic to help New Zealand grow. And that data, I think, was part of the impetus for Peter and Vicky and I and Cheewei talking about running this event. So I hope that sets the scene for what we're here to discuss this morning.
Toni, thank you. I might need that. Yeah,
sure. Here we go.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Cheewei Kwan. Take a couple of minutes to let those data points that Toni talked about sink in. In essence, you have a wealth of talent and experience coming back to shores. Now, on the flip side, as you have seen in the marketing, the few lines that went out to you coming to this event, is anecdotally, we're hearing some really interesting feedback from the ground, right? So on one hand, if you've been away for 8 to 10 years on average, individuals have found it really hard to connect back to the business community here. It's hard to break in, hard to find a network. You kind of feel, am I Kiwi, am I not? How do I get back into the senior level network? So that's what we're hearing. On the flip side, in a lot of the work we do in executive search, and I'm sure we will dive a bit deeper into that with my colleague Nick, the question that we've seen local Kiwi companies ask is, how do I leverage the skills that are coming back? So if you think primarily, if you are domestically focused in New Zealand, and all you're thinking of is maybe trans-Tasman, but you have Kiwis who are coming back with global remits and global responsibilities, deep vertical and broad horizontal experience. Sometimes we find local companies don't know how to make use of that, don't appreciate what they're coming back to offer. And that's kind of the two sides of the story. So it's a fascinating situation now, and absolutely, as you say, Toni, it's never happened before with the influx of talent coming back here. So what I like to do is really invite this eminently qualified panel and all of you out there, of course, to dive a bit deeper into the dynamics of what's going on here. Now, one thing we won't talk about is property prices, because that's not on the agenda. But before we dive in, and I'm going to invite the panelists to comment on some of these things, I'd like to just do some very brief introduction, just so you know where they're coming from, the background. And Toni, maybe just starting with you, so we'll go from this side. She's just taken on the role of Chief Executive for Kiwi Expat Association in the midst of COVID last year, June. And welcome. And your last role before that was with Fonterra, looking after digital marketing creative. So Toni very much has a brand marketing experience, but also spent 6 years in the UK across various marketing executive roles in the UK. Catherine, very warm welcome. Catherine is what I would call a very seasoned global executive with financial services. So trained as a lawyer, I believe, and your OE in the UK lasted 15 years before you decided to come back. And I think after coming back for 3 years, you decided, nah, not for me. Went back to UK with Barclays in 2013. And again, back, December last year, towards COVID and all that. And I believe your last role, you were looking after about 16,000 people in the bank that cuts across contact centers, products, and so really seasoned senior executive. And it's fantastic later to hear from you. What are some of the things you learned in your global adventures and what you brought back on shore? And she'd like us all to know that she's now really taking it easy, enjoying life back in New Zealand before plunging into the next big role. Right, Catherine, welcome. Joe, welcome. Joe is what I would call a very seasoned senior HR executive turned entrepreneur. So many years of experience in HR, started with Air New Zealand. And I think in your 13 years in Fonterra, probably worked across most continents that have an office with Fonterra. Right, Latin America, Middle East, Asia.
Not Middle East, but pretty much.
Yeah. So, 2 years ago, decided to head another corporate, started an organization called Future Work Studio, which is all about creating a digital platform to really look into the future of work, workforce planning, and so on. So, you might call a tech consulting company, and thoroughly enjoying your role now. So I think Joe brings a lot to this discussion in terms of having lived and worked overseas, and also as an employer of returning Kiwis. Last but not least, my colleague Nick, who's a partner with us, and it's been close to 6 years now.
Yeah.
Another trained lawyer, and I must say, Joe, you also had a background in law. Gosh. So Nick, again, trained lawyer and journalist, I might add. Spent 3 years in the UK, practicing law primarily with government sectors. But with Kerridge Partners, have led big searches over the last 6 years, and a lot of experience working with overseas talent to bring them back onshore. And I think it'd be great to contrast what you see with the returning Kiwis, how easy, difficult it is for them to come back into this country, and obviously also talk about the perspective of the employer. I might start off by inviting both Joe and Catherine to maybe share, Joe first, to share your global adventures. In essence, what are some of the things you learned overseas that you thought was really helpful when you come back onshore? And what brought you back here? Joe.
Sure. Well, I'm lucky enough that I came back, so I spent quite a bit of time in and out and came back with Fonterra. So I came back with a role already in play, which made it a lot easier. I think probably one of the biggest learnings for me coming back to New Zealand and working with a lot of other expats who come in and out or returnees to New Zealand is just that importance of being able to really frame your overseas experience in a way that is relevant for the local market. One of the biggest challenges, I think, often, particularly if you're engaging with domestic New Zealand companies, is it's just very hard to find those common experiences that mean you're on the same page. So focusing more on the skills rather than what you did. And one of the things I often talk to returnees about is rather than saying I led the markets in Africa, Middle East, and I did this and I did that. It's more, I've had roles where I've managed complex relationships, I've been able to get results done in a challenging environment. So really starting to be able to translate something that may not be familiar into something that's more familiar in the local market.
Oh, that's really helpful. And Nick, hold that, because I'd like to get your thoughts on that too, because I think one of the things that we had spoken about before is there's no point telling employers here about all the stuff you've done if you can't translate it to how it's going to work in New Zealand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Catherine, many years in London, I'm sure, and all over Europe, what are some of the things that you learned coming back to New Zealand that's really useful?
I think my reflection is the last 12 months have probably been the most seminal. And I think that's particularly because COVID is a sustained impact in the UK, and so business needed to change, and leadership needed to change, and people needed to change, and working practices need to change. And when I come home, it hasn't changed that much here. Lots has changed in New Zealand in 7 years of being away, but the acute impact of COVID has not impacted New Zealand for wonderful reasons. But the rest of the world is going to pivot as a result of the experiences that everybody's had. And I think for us, trying to get all the benefits of business change that are going to happen because of COVID without the misery that caused that change is going to be quite an interesting challenge. And so I think that, what have I got the most? It's been scale leadership and understanding how fast a really large organisation can change when it's put in a situation where it has no choice. And that creates wonderful opportunities. And I think to your question, listening to your data points, Toni, so why am I home now? I was used to coming home every 3 months. So I could very happily live in London and balance life if you can see your family every 3 or 4 months. I was privileged that I could afford it and that I had enough leave. COVID meant that just couldn't happen. And so I think that's a driver that will accelerate that return, because if you want to be a part of your family and your community and you can't juggle it anymore, then you only have one choice about where you are.
Toni, I'll come to you, and then Nick, I'd love you to come in. So what have you heard from returnees on this perspective in terms of, they've managed scale, they manage complexity. How do they become more relevant in this market? What have you heard from the folks out there?
Yeah, look, I think it's really challenging, and something that I faced coming back after a number of years overseas as well is that, particularly in the UK, you have very general roles. You have very specialist roles. You kind of go long and deep into quite specialist areas. And coming back into New Zealand, the size of the market and the organisations often don't have those mirror roles. And so you do have to think really carefully, to Joe's point, around what your transferable skills are. And also focus on areas that you can learn, your ability to adapt and to learn new things. When I came back from the UK, I'd been running the paywall operation at the Financial Times. Quite a unique role, and certainly at the time there were no paywalls coming back into New Zealand, and I had the unfortunate experience of a few recruiters sort of saying to me, oh well, look, I'm not entirely sure what we're going to do with you. And I sort of thought, well, hold on a minute, I'd never run a paywall before I ran a paywall. I'm pretty sure I'm going to be able to learn to do something here in the New Zealand market. And so, just really focusing on digging underneath the work that you've done, learning complex technology, being able to adapt, reading data flow and making business decisions on that. Those are, a couple of universal skills that any organisation, I believe, in New Zealand would be totally in awe of and would add significant value. So I think for returners coming back, it's about being flexible. I also think it's about employers being a little bit flexible as well. But I think it's about digging deeper and understanding, that ability and that agility and that perspective that you get being an overseas returner, and how that can be applied into roles and organisations within New Zealand.
Great. Nick, again, it's an introduction. You've done all these searches trying to bring overseas talent back here. And one of the things that we had talked about informally was perhaps sometimes they have the sense of entitlement. I've got international experience. When I come back, I should be back at this level. My compensation is this. I mean, talk to us about your broader experience in trying to attract overseas Kiwis to come back to top jobs.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd echo everything that's been said, particularly around the the skill base being in deep verticals in the New Zealand market. Because of the size of our businesses, we do tend to prefer people that have more rounded experience. To your question, I think the returning Kiwi is always a golden prize in a search. So whenever we're briefed, we're often briefed to do domestic searches, but they say, find Kiwis abroad. Those turn into international searches. I think the international experience gives you a halo effect. People are naturally curious about the experiences that you've developed overseas, and I think that there is an assumption that you will know the culture. I'd actually challenge that in some circumstances, because I think that if you went to school in New Zealand, you went to university here, you started your graduate career in your early part of your career, then you went offshore. If all of your formative leadership experiences in the United States or the UK, and you've been over in those markets long enough, essentially what you're doing is importing that leadership style back in. And I think from an employer's point of view, too often I've seen the assumption that nationality will be a determinant in the assimilation process. So I think that cuts both ways, Cheewei. I think that employers need to be more mindful that what you are doing is bringing back a different leadership style, so regardless of nationality. Secondly, a piece of advice I would have for returning Kiwis is we go offshore. We go to Australia, we go to the UK, we go to the States, Asia, knowing that we have to assimilate ourselves. I don't think the reverse always holds true. I think that I've seen on occasion people make the assumption that they'll just naturally click back into the environment. If you've been away for 10 or 15 years, this culture's changed significantly. Even just basic things like our attitude towards the Treaty of Waitangi, for instance. If you're working in the public healthcare sector, that has a meaningful impact to the way you go about your work. So I think there's kind of work and thinking to do on both sides of the equation.
Yeah, that's great. Let's dive a bit deeper into this kind of reverse assimilation that you brought up, Nick, and I'd like Joe and maybe Catherine to talk about this. You've both employed overseas Kiwis, I'm sure. You've dealt with Kiwis not just here, but globally. What are your experiences in first yourself coming back here? What has changed in terms of the business context? Your own personal journey when you assimilated back here? And the second question linked to that is, as an employer or head of HR, Joe in your case, how do you see overseas Kiwis that you've hired into Fonterra coming back into New Zealand? How do they assimilate?
So some of the things I didn't know that I needed to learn when I came back last time. One is that the New Zealand companies are more like families, and so the informal networks, and everybody knows everybody or is married to somebody else. I'd forgotten that, and it took a while to re-engage that it says I just need to assume that everybody knows everybody. So that was a good first thing. I never got over missing Sunday papers, actually. That was a assimilation that didn't happen. And I'm finding that again now. It's like, oh, that's right, I missed the papers. But some things are easier. So back to your point about, I mentored a number of New Zealanders in London, and Barclays is a very British, very polite bank. And we, New Zealanders are more direct, and that can have consequences that you don't intend it to. And despite the fact that most of my growing up career has been in the UK, that bit hasn't changed. And so I had to learn to soften the New Zealand directness and then to coach other New Zealanders to say, can't you see what happens when you go that hard? It's like you can't do that here. So it works both ways. But I think your point that says you need to pause and realise that you're different and you can't assume that it's the same. Even in 7 years, the workplace here has changed from when I was here last time. And I can see that already. And I can see the things that I need to learn and embrace in order to be able to be resonant here in a way that I would have never got that experience in the UK.
So it's really, adopting the same mindset as when you go overseas to when you come back home. Like you take it as another new
it's the subtle things. Like I remember when I went to the UK, nobody said come round for dinner. And they'd say we'll meet you at the pub. And it took a while to understand Englishman home castle thing is a real thing, and so you just need to not be offended by it. It took me quite a while to work that out because it was a subtle, unsaid difference. And it's exactly the same on coming back. There's subtle, unsaid differences that you just need to know that you're going to make mistakes on and learn.
Joe?
Yeah, it probably prompts two thoughts based on some of the conversations I've had with people recently too. So the first is an experience that New Zealanders are very relationship based and is a broad generalisation. So people are often pleasantly surprised. You come back to New Zealand, you start networking, people are always willing to have a coffee. There's always time to chat and recommend people. Often it doesn't convert. So, I talk to a lot of people who say, I've had all these coffees and everyone's like, oh, you're amazing, you'll have no problem finding a job. But then actually, we're just being very nice often. So that can be quite a transition for people to understand, it doesn't always and adjust to that. And then the other flip side that you can see is people who come back with amazing experience. And this is once again a broad generalisation, but New Zealand organisations often hiring for that experience also don't want to be told all the things that they've done wrong before hiring that person.
Yeah.
And you have this sometimes, people come back with best of intent, but here's what I've done, this is what you need to do, oh my goodness, you're really backwards, why haven't you thought about this? And that creates a rejection, an organ rejection. So it's that coming back to your point, applying those practices, listen, take the time, really understand the environment, bring that amazing expertise to bear, but do it in a way that actually you understand the local context and don't make assumptions, I think is really important.
Toni, what stories have you heard in similar contexts in terms of the ease or difficulty with overseas Kiwis coming back and finding good jobs?
I think we at Kia we work with lots of Kiwis coming back, and obviously the core of what we do is we connect people. And so I think a couple of things. I think connection is really important, particularly in a small market coming back. And certainly, I would encourage everyone in the room when they leave today to think about how they could be connecting Kiwis coming back, because it is just so invaluable for them building networks and getting to meet everyone. But also, to Joe's point, it doesn't always translate into roles. And so we do meet with a lot of Kiwis who have to sort of redo their CVs 2 or 3 different times until they kind of really learn the right way to pitch themselves into market. And so, I think it is a real challenge. You've got to know the people. It's as much about understanding some of the terminology and some of the language within the market when you're meeting and networking with people, in terms of what's going to land in your conversations with people, as it is about kind of making those connections. But then it's a bit of resilience and keeping trying. We placed someone recently who had or supported the placement of someone who'd been almost right through the procurement, through the recruitment process, and then we kind of called them out right at the end to this employer, and they went, oh right, oh yes, oh okay, just called out a couple of different things about them that we thought would land, and then they ended up with this new amazing job. And so I think it's just about finding that language and a bit of perseverance and resilience. But what we're hearing is that it is tough. It is really tough.
Nick, I'd like you to talk a bit about that sort of expectation, whether it's the seniority of the role that they're coming back into, or the pay, or whatever, if you're used to living in London or in an expatriate type thing. What are some of the things you've heard from candidates?
Oh, look, I think most people recognise that the remuneration is not going to be the equivalent. I mean, if you're working in the UAE or if you're working in New York, I think most people recognise that. And I think people, and you would have seen this, Toni, people come back to New Zealand for a variety of different reasons. The role is often primary among them, but there are a whole bunch of other factors. So I haven't actually encountered that being too much of an issue. The remuneration's not the bigger thing. I think it's more around the role itself, how I'm going to translate into that role, and then the lifestyle that's built around that. And I think that's particularly important if you've been away for a long time, because you really are having to sort of start life again.
Okay. I actually like to open this up to all of you across the room here. We've got a great group here, both potential employers, potential talent that are coming back, or talent that have come back to New Zealand. So let's throw this open to the folks out there before I dive into another series of questions. So if you just put up your hand and, yes, please. Could you just tell us? Yeah.
Hi, so my name's Trisha, and I've known a couple of people on the panel. So I kind of bring three perspectives. I myself have lived in the Netherlands, the UK, and the US before coming back to New Zealand in 2017. And since then, I've been interviewing returning Kiwis and writing the How to Have a Happy Homecoming blog. And the themes that have come through in the survey have actually been there for a decade. I would say there was a piece of research done by Kurt Inkson about 2011 which actually said the same thing. New Zealanders are coming back with great intent, they want to add value, they're going into organisations, and that the talent that they bring is not being utilised, and that's a real kind of missed opportunity. Professionally, I'm the head of talent at Public Trust, so I actually kind of have this deep concern about the fact that we might miss this, we might continue to miss this opportunity. But I am seeing shifts, and even in my own organisation, which is a New Zealand crowned entity, we've been doing this piece of work around what's an ideal GM, or what's an ideal CEO, or what's an ideal head of. And one of the things that we're looking at is whether or not international experience or multi-market experience is actually going to be key. So what I can see starting to happen is that the bar is going to get raised in organisations, which is actually going to kind of elevate, I think, the way that New Zealand businesses operate. And I'm very, very encouraged by that. So I'm curious to know whether other organisations are starting to have different conversations about their talent profiles, you know, seeing who they're competing with, both in terms of customers, but also in terms of the talent that they bring in order to be able to deliver that world-class service to customers. You know, you need people who actually understand and have an experience of world-class service because they've lived it in other markets.
So what I understand is obviously the challenge is to what extent does local companies appreciate that global perspective that they bring back to New Zealand, right? And I think to your point, Trish, increasingly with the global connectedness of businesses, we just can't stay in our little shell. And as you said, your organization is really starting to look at what else can overseas Kiwis offer that the locals don't. Mm-hmm. Let's hear from the employers first. You know, our time at Fonterra, Joe.
Yeah, and it's funny, I was just reflecting actually more on the startup environment as well, which is a conversation I was part of just the other day with a group of investors saying that one of the challenges we have in New Zealand, and you see it in the startup ecosystem, is that actually we have a lack of competition here. So it's easier to be successful early in a startup in New Zealand and then really struggle if you go US market entry, for example, because all of a sudden there's real competition. Often many of the biggest competitors don't come to New Zealand because we're just too small. And, you know, I think that translates out that as we become more globalised and more connected, we really need to be thinking as New Zealand organisations is how do we bring those people, often who have worked in those very edgy, competitive markets, back into New Zealand to make sure we are productive and we are competitive. You know, our productivity as a nation is one of the lowest in the OECD, and we need to shift that to be successful long term. So absolutely, you know, everything you're saying, Tricia, really, really resonates, and I think it applies as equally to the startup environment as it does to the corporate sector. And there's this huge pool of talent that we can really leverage to get New Zealand ahead. Yeah.
Okay, Catherine, anything you want to add?
I'm hopeful that the overseas experience is valued more now than it was 7 years ago, because the reason I went back to the UK is I looked for a job here for a year and couldn't find one that felt even vaguely stretching. And I think part of the challenge is New Zealand's a wonderful place to live. So if you're bright and talented, you may not want to leave New Zealand. So we have less exporting of talent sometimes, which means there's less movement at senior levels, which means it's harder for people to get further up in organisations. And at that point in time, the fact that I'd worked in the UK was almost a problem rather than an asset. But to your point about, I didn't know about a paywall before, you know, the skills that you bring is an ability to apply yourself to a complex problem. the fact that the fact that you've had to do it in repeated and complex environments is actually an asset that can help in this market. But I think historically that hasn't been as valued. Hopefully with the changes that we're seeing, both with the world being more global and more connected, actually that skill set and the experience we tap into more than I think we've done in the past.
Well, I think you're right, and I talk about the globalism quotient, which I think is a set of skills and competencies that organisations say they want: growth mindset, learning agility, cultural intelligence. All of these things that organisations are talking about looking for. You've got these groups of people who actually bring them, because it's not just you went overseas and you were successful in your job. You moved to a new country, you created a new social network, you figured out how things worked, you created a life. That's kind of resourcefulness, resilience, ability to learn and adapt. And what's been really interesting in my own interviews is that the people who found it easiest to move back to New Zealand are the ones who moved around a lot, because they've done it every few. So we did it every 3 or 4 years. We moved to a new country and had to figure out how it worked. So when we came back to New Zealand, we had to figure out how it worked. The ones who struggle the most seem to be the ones who are essentially migrating back. 15 years in the UK, come back to New Zealand. It's a new migrant experience. So I think also that awareness as an employer of the whole person and what they're going through, and how do you ease that transition for them, and what sort of support do you put in place so that they can feel welcomed, feel included, not just for the skill set they bring, but also for the person that they are.
Could I say something in that?
Could you tell us name and where you?
Stuart. I was away for about 25 years, but I've been back quite a long time. But I think, to your really interesting points, thank you, I think people are clear part of the way about what it is that they want, but what they don't say they want, and this is to your point too, Jo, I think, what they don't say they want is they don't want you to come back and belittle people. Mm-hmm. So, just be careful when you come back. One of the expressions I use for people is, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them in those proportions. I found myself, 25 years is a long time, I know, but I just had to think, shut up, because the last people I was in London and New York and Amsterdam for all that time, people don't want to hear about that. They want to hear about what you can do to help make their lives better. They don't give a toss about you. So, I think just be, my advice to expats is just be really careful. Mm-hmm. New Zealanders are not shrinking violets, but they're inviting you back to help them, not to belittle them or make them feel small, or to make you feel better. Mm. But I think your comments are great. Thank you so much.
Stuart, thank you. So the funny thing, I'll just add on to that, is maybe 25 years ago we were all humble and egalitarian, and we're not tall poppies. But after some time away, you kind of get a different halo to the next point, that you bring a lot of great things back, great tidings, and that doesn't sit well with a lot of.
I think the humility point is a big one. Regardless of how impressive your CV is, the behavioural element is critically important in New Zealand. So the markers of success, might be the same in Auckland as they are in London, as they are in New York. The performance of the P&L you're running. But the way you go about achieving that success is really important here, and there's an awful lot of attention paid to it. That's not to say that the behavioural elements aren't important in other cultures, but I think it goes back to that re-assimilation point. When you're coming back in, obviously focus on the success you need to achieve in your role, but how you go about achieving that success is just as important.
Yeah, and Nick, I think to add on to that, I think we'll probably all agree that we're such a small village that if your reputation at company A is like that, rest assured the rest of New Zealand will get to hear about it. Right? There's no running to another state, another country in Europe, and you start all over again. Great CV, no one knows your background. So that's the reality of who we are and where we are. Yep.
Hi, Gavin Lennox here. I'm the CEO of the Ice House. I just really wanted to raise and get some of the panelists' input on this. Toni and I have been talking about one of the friction points for returning Kiwis is actually being able to navigate the ecosystem here in New Zealand. Whilst we've talked about very few degrees of freedom, many people know one another, but it's still quite fragmented in terms of the startup ecosystem, the corporate structures, and the investment environment. So very open to ideas from this group. The idea that Toni and I and others have been touching upon is a sort of a simple directory which would help returning Kiwis kind of at least understand who the key players are, who to connect with, to start those conversations and make the connections to the right people. So open to ideas from this group.
Kevin, thanks for the question. So essentially, how does one rebuild networks having been away for so long? What are some of the key players in this market that could really help move that along? Toni, why don't I start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think it's a mixture of things. I think it's a bit of desk research as well, and understanding the organisations that you might want to connect with. If you can find Kiwis in those organisations who have been overseas and come back themselves, and you might have a bit of an in there. I think it is, pumping your networks, and it can be hard when you've been away for 10 years to come back and people are in quite different places, but just, putting yourself out there and asking for that coffee. I think obviously recruiters, and there are many in the room, are absolutely invaluable in terms of understanding the landscape of a market and connecting you in with people. I'd also think that organisations like Kia are there for you to come and connect with, and certainly we run a number of meetups for different sort of levels of returners. We have a monthly meetup, the second Wednesday of every month, where returners can just come and meet with each other. And I think building that community with people who are going through similar challenges as you, and sharing learnings about what might be working for them is really important. But it is a bit of hard work, and you do have to put yourself out there, which is a challenge. But definitely tap into people who have done it before, organisations that are there to help you.
I think it's great, and obviously Kia can do a lot more in terms of connecting returnees. I think, Kevin, what I understand, the challenge is also connecting the returnees with the potential employers out there. Where is that platform, or what platforms exist today? Thoughts on that for both of you?
And I'll let you go first, because none that I'm aware of.
I think it is the have a lot of coffees, but also have coffees with purpose. So because people are willing to take coffees, have the coffee. So this has been a great conversation. Who else should I connect with? Who do you think would be useful? And go in, I think, with an open mind that you want to learn from the person you're having coffee with, not tell them all about the reasons you're great, because then you get a much better conversation and it opens up other opportunities in the network. But most people, I think it is the old-fashioned, just building up that network. But there are organisations like the Ice House where, once you talk to someone in the Ice House, then there's a natural network that sits behind that. So also being smart and a little bit strategic around who you are meeting with, what are their networks. And I think sometimes, people are a little bit reluctant because there can be a bit of a Kiwi, I don't want to feel like I'm, using or I'm abusing that relationship. But actually, most people in senior roles in New Zealand, I think, are really open to share their networks and to welcome people to be a part of that network. So.
Just a thought, because one of the discussions we were having is we don't know, out of all of you, how many are employers and how many are returning Kiwis. And it would be quite interesting to do a purposeful meetup, not just the returnees, even if it's by broad sectors, that said, actually, we've got 10 care contacts that are all coming back in, they've got this sort of experience, who are the people on the other side that might be interested in them, and purposefully put you all in a room. Yeah. Because that takes away the awkwardness of, it's like you are all here to have that conversation, so there's no ambiguity about it.
Well, in many ways, this is why we put this thing together, because, Catherine, to your point, there's probably 60-40, about 60% Kerridge Partners network, which are primarily executives and companies here. A number of us here are from the Kia network. So essentially, we're asking for a Kia dating app. Right? Matching interest, skills, and opportunities. Nick, any thoughts on that?
Look, I think search firms like ours, we can always play a role in that, in brokering introductions. We do that all the time, but look, it's just one aspect. I'd like to go back to a point that was made earlier about, I think it was a really good one, that the talent that's coming into the country now, all of this international experience, it'll be interesting to see over time what that does. So it's probably not going to have an immediate impact, but I wonder in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time, the expectation, as you say, gets raised that the global experience, the experience in different markets is important. Because as a search consultant, I still see the tyranny of familiarity at play. So we're often asked to do searches to find, the best and brightest wherever they might be in the world, including the returning Kiwis. But anecdotally, when it comes down to the crunch, more often than not, people will default to what's familiar. So I think that there's a learning part, or an evolution, I should say, that employers need to go on as well, and to be confident in taking that risk.
It's interesting you mentioned that, Nick, because some of you may be aware, 2 years ago, Kerridge Partners released a research report on how do we better develop chief executives for New Zealand. In fact, there are copies lying around out there. And this was obviously pre-COVID, right? And it was interesting for us, having interviewed 41 executives across the country, that when we speak to those leaders who are what you might call primarily homegrown New Zealand-centered career, versus those who either have come from offshore or are returnees, the amount of value they place to that overseas experience differs hugely, as you can imagine. So folks who have kind of never led offshore would say, you can do it without that. It's not a big deal not having done that. The folks who have experienced leadership and whatever they do offshore, coming back, would say it's necessity to be aware of the cultural differences, assimilation, putting yourselves in the other person's shoes, all that sort of behavioral stuff becomes a lot more important. So I'm really interested, Nick, to your point, post-COVID, now that's happened, the ability to do that even better will probably, hopefully, be held in higher regard amongst leaders here.
Just a question for Nick, just building on that point. Do you see a mix in the contract versus permanent roles in terms of employers being able to manage their risk around taking on employees? You see the default to what's familiar. Have you seen more contract roles come up where they're able to take that risk?
My perception on that is skewed because the work that we do is all, we mainly operate at the executive and governance level, so they're almost always permanent roles. So I don't, perhaps Toni, I don't feel particularly qualified to answer that. It's a very good point though, and I wonder if there are other recruitment agents out there in the audience who might specialise in. Here we go.
My name's Craig, and we work with a lot of people who are coming in from offshore and executive coaching. What I've seen over the last 5-6 years around contracting and perm is that prospective candidates have been prepared to take contracting roles as a step in. So whereas around about 10 years ago I would have said 5% of C-level or executive or leadership weren't looking for contract at all, I would say now most are happy to actually do that as an interim step because we realise that it's going to take 12 months or more, potentially in some cases, for them to actually secure a role.
And have you seen those contract roles convert into permanent ones?
Yes. So often, and I'm not sure whether it all started off with the employment law situation, the 3 months trial or whatever, but what we found was that they go in and they do a specific role, and it might be around transformational change, digital, whatever. It is a little bit like dating app. Like, they get to date, and often I've said, the recruitment or talent acquisition process is horribly flawed because we actually date that person for a couple of hours, and yet we actually spend a significant part of our life with that person, and we don't really know them at all. And so the whole contracting game is actually now turned into the dating procedure. They get to know the organisation gets to know them, and sometimes it's a match made in heaven. So yeah, I think contracting is absolutely on the rise.
I would
Vicky?
Vicky McLean from Kerridge Partners. I think on Craig's point, on a contract, you get the opportunity to try before you buy. But it's also the same for a returning Kiwi, that coming in on a contract, it gives you the opportunity to assimilate back into the country and just see how New Zealand works. What, when you come back, is how your value set is matching what companies are looking for. So really, I think in a COVID world, that you will see a lot more contracts because people can turn them off and they can turn them on with greater ease, and so therefore mitigating their risk. But for an incoming candidate, I think it gives you an opportunity to not go into a permanent role and find, well, that didn't work, and you can be forgiven for one bad choice, but you can't be forgiven for more. So it's a really good way for candidates to come into the market and test.
I think it comes with an element of risk, though, because I have seen people come back into the market and take contract roles, and one contract leads to another, and it doesn't necessarily convert into that permanent position. I can think of a couple of examples off the top of my head. So I guess it's just a balance. It's a balance that you have to weigh, whether you're patient enough to wait for that permanent role, or whether the other factors that Vicky's talked about, actually getting on the ground, going through the assimilation process. That's going to be very person dependent.
It depends how much savings you have, right? Before you decided to take a short-term role, or look for the ideal job.
And how patient you're prepared to be.
Please.
I'm Michelle, and I've, as you can probably hear by my accent, I'm one of many people who come as a partner of a Kiwi. So I'm actually really curious your perspective, because my background's in technology leadership in the United States and in London. And what's been really interesting as a partner, and I've met a few other people, I know I'm not the only one, is that technically I'm a returning Kiwi, but my native experience is in these foreign markets. And so it's really resonant having kind of this advice of contextualizing yourself to the market. But in my case, and in many other partners' cases, we're kind of trying to contextualize, oh, thank you, apparently my mic's so we're trying to contextualize ourselves both to the New Zealand market and this native understanding of global markets. And so I guess my questions for you is, one, am I unique to circumstances coming to Kia, not being a Kiwi, as a partner of a Kiwi? Are there more of me? And then also, what is the appetite for native knowledge in these markets as opposed to secondhand knowledge of gone overseas and now having a perspective? I'm just curious, your advice for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have lots of partners of Kiwis come to our Kia events, and I think they bring a really unique perspective. I know when I came back, I brought a British husband who was in the media industry, and there are all sorts of unique challenges that you guys face, and so I think although there might not be a distinct support network for you, you are very welcome within the Kia community. And I think a lot of the same advice applies, but I actually wonder if it is just that much harder for you guys because you don't have those cultural references to draw on as much. So yeah, you probably need a little bit more support from us, actually. Thanks for that.
So as employers, what are your thoughts, in terms of the partners of returning Kiwis in your experience?
Well, just with Michelle's, with your experience particularly, and I wonder whether that's a link to the Ice House. I think our technology environment in New Zealand is going to come under huge pressure in the next few years, just with a lack of skills relative to the growth. And Kiwi companies should be snapping up anyone with any technology leadership experience. And maybe that's something that needs to be looked at more formally as well, because we're seeing it already in data science, for example. There's a huge looming shortage of data scientists in New Zealand, and that will expand out. We just don't have enough skills here, and with the borders having been closed, it's been harder to get some of those skills in. So yeah,
I was hoping to come in and scoop up several of those.
Yeah, exactly. The smart people in the room will be talking to Michelle.
Clayton Wakefield. I'm just interested in the numbers. Maybe this is a question for Toni. Sounds like a lot of people are going to come back, and can we absorb them all? Is there a capacity in the New Zealand market? Are we going to end up with a lot of people having coffees with each other endlessly? So it sounded like some pretty big numbers. And the corollary to that is, will the young people be going overseas? So in 10 years' time, we won't have a requirement for care because we won't have built up the overseas experience. So I'm interested in both of those questions. So yeah.
Yeah. So look, I think care's been around for the last 20 years, and so we've kind of survived a number of migratory patterns. So if you look at the late, sort of the early 2000s when we were set up, it was all about Kiwis going overseas for perhaps greener pastures, larger opportunities, and Kia was initially set up to maintain contact with those Kiwis, keep them connected to home, to New Zealand, and allow them to give back to New Zealand if they wanted to. With Kiwis now kind of the reverse brain gain, if you will, it's about how do we bring and support that talent back into New Zealand. And, you know, I think, yes, there are Kiwis coming home, but there are still a huge number of Kiwis who are staying overseas. And, you know, from Kia's perspective, they are equally as important because they still hold those international networks that are incredibly important to our international trade development efforts and, you know, lots of other important things for the country. So whilst, you know, I'm sort of here today talking about returning talent and the huge opportunity that they bring, I think overseas Kiwis remain a really core focus, and I think always will. I think to the second part of your point, you know, it is going to be a really interesting place to watch over the next few years because I think we do have a lot of young Kiwis who have not been able to go on their OEs. So kids or young people who would have been travelling at the moment, perhaps going and doing other roles. And when the world opens up, borders open up, you know, I think we will lose a lot of them. What form their overseas experience takes as a result of COVID, I think, remains to be seen. But I think equally, you know, brand New Zealand has never been stronger right now. And I know that there are a lot of non-Kiwis who are desperate to come and move to New Zealand. So when borders open up, yes, we might lose people, but, you know, who are we going to gain coming back? And so I think it's, you know, the world at the moment is just such an unknown, but really I think the opportunity is here for New Zealand, particularly New Zealand companies, to be thinking really strategically about how they can make the most of opportunities as they come through. You know, we have some amazing technology talent coming back in, and that came through in the survey as well. The highest percentage of Kiwis coming back were senior technologists, and that is our absolute #1 skills gap. You know, if you look at Xero, who is a partner of Kia, they have often up to 200 technology roles that they are trying to fill. So I think, you know, there are roles here for a number of these Kiwis coming back. It is about that matchmaking piece in terms of how we kind of bring them together. But I also don't think there's a quick fix. So yes, you know, I think a dating app would be absolutely amazing and would definitely go some way, but I think there is no silver bullet here. I think it is about New Zealand companies being open and flexible and, you know, looking to take advantage of the opportunity that is in front of them. I also think it is about returners being flexible and humble and all of the things that we've spoken about today, but it is also about legwork and making things happen on both sides. So I don't think, you know, there is a silver bullet. I think we're going to have to continue to adapt and do the hard yards to kind of make it work and make the most of the opportunity.
I'm very conscious of time because some of you might be running off. I might want to just take one final question from... Sorry, it's one at the back. But please feel free to stay back and speak with all of us informally. Yes, question.
I'm Kat. Yes, good. Kat Moody. I just returned last month from the United States. I actually just wanted to kick off the matchmaking. I think a question that Catherine had asked, like who's in the room. So I'm just really curious. I heard that there's like New Zealand employers, recruiters, and returnees. So if you're a recruiter, can you stick your hand up? Okay, people who are looking for jobs, find those people. And then the New Zealand employers, where are you? Cool. And or the returnees, partners, Kiwis. Okay, awesome. That's it.
Well, thank you for doing that. We didn't want to make it so explicit that we seat you at three corners of the room in your sort of profile. It becomes so overt, but the Kiwi style is we do it very subtly. But thank you. Look, please feel free to join us for coffee and talk to those that put their hands up. Look, we'd love to do a lot more of this. Obviously, with COVID, this was postponed. It's great to see all of you here today. And whether it's Kerridge or Kia, we will continue to really build this network because there's so much we can benefit as a country if we really know how to leverage folks who have come back with great things to offer. Let me turn over to my colleague Vicky to just formally close. Coffee, I understand there's a fresh serving of breakfast food out there. Please feel free to stay back. Vicky, over to you.
So thank you very much to our panel, to Nick, Joe, Catherine, Toni and Cheewei, and to my colleagues from Kerridge Partners for putting this event on, and to all of your colleagues for supporting us and supporting each other. I think there are some great sound bites to take out from today. I was a trailing spouse, so I immigrated to New Zealand in 2004. You've got some hard work ahead of you, but it's the best thing I ever did. Meeting Peter Kerridge was probably the second best thing I ever did.
That's not your partner.
No. All right, yeah. Get that straight. I think, Catherine, you made something, you made a comment that really resonated with me and will probably resonate with many people around the room. And I am concerned that New Zealand's going to get left behind. We made this great leap forward, and even now you see our vaccination program is much slower. Now, I know we're not in the dire straits of other countries, but you can really begin to see that impact and that concern about skills. I think some of the subtleties about coming back or coming to for the first time as a new migrant and re-entering the country is, I know, coming from Scotland, I used to say to people, you're going to have to come for supper. And people would look at me and say, is she inviting me for a piece of toast in the evening? It's terminology, it's the subtleties, it's reading the room. And I think the other thing which we touched on, but we didn't delve into enough, there is a huge temptation if you're looking for a job to get an income to jump at the first thing that comes along. You cannot afford to make mistakes. So do your due diligence. Ask to speak to employees. Ask to speak to people who have left an organisation. Because when I came to New Zealand, I made a huge mistake in joining an organisation. I asked all about the current organisation, but I spoke to people who left it and they didn't really understand what that organisation was like under new leadership. And I made a huge mistake. So that was my mistake. So really invest in your due diligence. And I think the context, particularly for you or for somebody coming back from New Zealand, is really turning the conversation round to Joe's point about seek to understand and then make yourself relevant and your skills and your expertise, make that relevant. But the final thing is really try and understand the chemistry, because it comes back to Kiwis, and I now consider myself a Kiwi, is chemistry is incredibly important in working with someone. So try and read the room and understand that chemistry. So thank you very much to our external panelists, thank you to Kia, and thank you to Kerridge Partners.